This is a public event. I'm running this to show folks what we're doing inside the course. I've added a ton over the past few months focused on the law school application side of things, the law school admission side of things, but I'm realizing that since my focus over the years has primarily been the LSAT, a lot of folks might not know everything we've got going on the admissions side. I've been running a handful of personal statement workshops like what we're going to be doing tonight. I will also be covering in the future character and fitness, optional essays and addenda, diversity statements, resume. We've got all of that coming up over the next month or two. So those of you inside the course, stay tuned for that. I may do some public events like that as well, just to give folks a little bit of a taste of that. So I'm curious, just out of everyone who's here tonight, how many of you do not have a personal statement draft yet, or do not have a topic? Just type in the chat or raise your hand. I'd love to get a sense of where everybody is on that. So I see James raising his hand. I see Emily, Shia, lots of folks here. Awesome, great. All right, so let's see. James, since you actually raised your hand, why don't we start with you? Would you want to talk through a little bit of what you're thinking about in terms of topics?
In terms of topics, what I did was I wrote down what the most meaningful events in my life were. And then I created a separate list for events that motivated me to go to law school. And my intention is to create separate drafts from each of those lists. I was thinking maybe one or two from each list. So that way I can have a personal statement that is easy to tie to law school, but also a different personal statement that focuses more on raw and unfettered emotion to make it more compelling, and then worry about why law school later.
Nice. I really like that. I think that's a really wise approach. And it's something I would actually recommend, where if you're considering a few different topics, make them separate and then write a little bit on each. So maybe you've got 2 or 3 topics. One's a bit more personal and raw, one's emotional. Then you have another one that's maybe more professional in nature. And then you could potentially bucket all 3 into different essays. Like one's an optional essay, maybe one's a diversity statement, maybe one's a primary personal statement. If one involved disciplinary action or running into trouble with the law, character and fitness might be a good route for that. Is that kind of how you're thinking about it?
Right, yeah. And because I don't want to necessarily make it contrived as though the essay were created for the purpose of explaining why I'm going to law school, because my concern was that might temper some of the emotional appeal of it. And I don't necessarily intend to create a complete first draft if it becomes too difficult to write or if it seems too contrived.
Nice. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. You may find that you're not getting a lot of traction with it, but rather than having it all be theoretical, like, oh, that could be a good topic, actually seeing how far can you go. And you might do 300 words as a taste, or you could go all the way and do 1,200 words, 1,500 words, just let it all pour out, and then go through revision after revision to chop it down to what will ultimately be around 500 words, 2 pages, double-spaced, normal-sized font, about 12 point, more or less. That's the goal you're aiming for. But yeah, either way, it works. As long as you're getting something on the screen, getting something on paper, that's really the first step.
Precisely. And I have a lot of experience with writing, and not to humble brag, I've written 2 books, and what you said about just getting something on the page is absolutely critical, because all writer's block is just the expectation that the next sentence you're going to write is going to be gold. It's okay to write shit as long as it's not in the final draft, but just get the ideas flowing, the words on the page.
That's exactly right. FBR, fast, bad, and wrong. That's the idea. Just get it out there and then iterate from there. Fantastic. I'd love to hear from some other folks. Naina, do you want to share a little bit more about where you're at with your personal statement?
Sure. I've actually started writing about one event that I wanted to talk about, but then I thought it was bad, so I deleted that and I started another one. So I'm just right now figuring out what I should talk about. Like, I have a list of events, but I don't want to talk about all of them in one essay, like you said earlier. So I'm trying to see which ones are the most important and then write about those. So I'm like in the initial stage of, figuring that out.
Nice. Would you mind sharing 1 or 2 of the topics you're considering?
Sure. So I was thinking about when I was working as a forensics mental health case manager, I saw a lot of not to say injustices or things that were done wrongly. So I've actually had experience with several people there. So I wanted to talk about a few stories, maybe one or two in my personal statement, but beginning the essay with my experience as an immigrant, a refugee, and then tying those experiences that I had while working at the working as a forensics case manager and what kind of experiences I had with people from that background, and then kind of tie it with why I want to go to law school and focus on immigration law. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, fantastic. That's a really compelling story, really compelling background. I'm sure that you could make a lot of it in a personal statement. So I'm excited to see where you take that. And since you're in the course, we'll be able to talk about that more in the coming weeks and months as well. One idea that occurs to me, though, is have you considered writing a diversity statement?
Yes. Mhm. I was thinking about writing that about the challenges that I've faced or opportunities that I missed because of my refugee status when I first came here. But I also thought that I would touch that a little bit in the beginning as an introduction on my personal statement, not talk about it a lot, but just as like as a segue to get into my experiences and why law. Is that
Fantastic.
a good idea? Okay.
That sounds great. Yeah, I mean, it's all in the execution. So let's see what you do with it. And feel free to just write up a rough draft, either a taste of one, couple hundred words, or even better, go all the way, do 1,200, 1,500, and then we'll chop it down.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing. I had someone ask me, do I think size 10 font is too small? I mean, yeah, I wouldn't play games with it. I wouldn't play games with it. They're going to notice when you're looking at dozens or hundreds or thousands of these in a very short period, any font size changes or playing with the page margins, it's going to stick out like a sore thumb. So don't try to play games with it. And then depending on the way in which you're submitting it, you may not even have the choice. So I wouldn't be thinking about that. I would actually it's difficult, but let's do the work of actually chopping it down to the appropriate length that they're really looking for you to do. And we have an admission session coming up tomorrow as well, where we'll talk with an admission officer about things like, I know you were asking Ayana also about the resume. And so we'll talk about some of those things too, what best practices, what not to do, all of that. So we've got some actual personal statements we could take a look at. And so I think while theory is good, practice is even better. But before we do, I wanted to talk through a handful of personal statement topics to avoid. I've written some of my own bad versions of personal statements. These are not personal. I've just made them up because I've seen them a lot. So one is the autobiography. Ever since I was 10 years old, I wanted to be a lawyer. I argued about XYZ with my parents. I always liked to read the fine print and would pester my parents with questions about what all these legal terms meant. It continued in school when I argued XY policies for a higher grade from the teacher using their own grading rubric. How clever was I? I did debate and was even on a panel with XYZ famous person. They said I was the most impressive young person they'd ever encountered. My college had an unfair policy about dining hall meal plans that I got changed. Now in my job, I advocate for XYZ by helping clients navigate policies, loopholes, all that bureaucracy. Most recently, when my parents had a hard time getting out of a cruise booking during COVID, I found the fine print that got them to give us a full refund of the deposit and everything. There are a lot of problems with XYZ policies on the national level, and I want to change that. I will bring perseverance, diligence, and hard work to whatever I do. Based on my previous professional and personal experiences, I am confident that X School of Law is the best place to achieve my goals. Thank you. So I hope you realize that there are several terrible problems with a personal statement along these lines. Most of it, obviously, I would scrap entirely. If I were to look for the little gold nugget in this that could be expanded upon, this person has helped clients navigate various policies, loopholes, bureaucracy. If this theoretical applicant could go deep on that, sharing some anecdotes, some examples, some real personal experiences and reflections on what they did in that line of work, that could have the makings of a decent personal statement. But you don't want to laundry list several things you've done. You don't want to talk about wanting to be a lawyer since you were the age of 10. That's not really something we should take seriously, especially not simply because you like to argue. So let's have real, meaningful, concrete experiences that you've done and highlight those, not talking about college dining hall meal plans or arguing with a teacher, and certainly don't brag. So that's one common trope I would really aim to stay away from. Travel. I never understood how much privilege I had until I went to X country for a semester or week or family trip. I thought I had it hard living as a college student working at the same time, but these people didn't even have clean water. It made me realize my obligation to help others and devote my life to public service. There are many policy changes that need to be made, such as XYZ. So don't spend a lot of time talking about policy changes you want to make. They're not looking for your policy proposals. You haven't been to law school yet. They also don't want to hear about you recognizing your privilege during a short trip somewhere. If you were somewhere for a very long period of time, different story, but travel essays I would typically stay away from. On a similar note, don't talk about how your home country is less free or less good than the American way of life and how the rule of law is essential to a free society and that you're inspired by your experience with the American legal system or with some other country's legal system. If they're in the US, they probably think there are some good things about the free society, democracy, all of that. And it's not personal at all. So if anybody could have written it and it's not particular to you, stay away. Anything about a low GPA or low LSAT score during the semester, either related to adjusting to college or COVID disruption or protests, police brutality, riots, Black Lives Matter activism, all of that, stay away from it. They're going to see 1,000 essays like that. And it's also not really a personal essay. It's talking about potentially why your GPA or your LSAT score suffered, maybe even due simply to the digital LSAT or LSAT Flex transition. I would think long and hard about writing one of these essays in general. And if you do, don't make it a personal statement, make it a separate addendum and ask yourself, really, truly, is it necessary to write this? There may be cases, of course, where it is, but otherwise I'd stay away. And finally, don't spend an essay talking only about a role model, someone you admire, XYZ person, you've always looked up to them. And whenever you had a struggle, they've supported you and inspired you. And now you want to support others the exact same way, especially if you never even met them. Again, make it about you. Make it about you. It's the biggest thing I'll say there. Now, enough on that. Let's dive into some of these personal statements. So I've got a link here. I will share in the chat. This is a PDF of several statements, specifically 4 of these several statements I received submitted to me on social media via Facebook and Instagram. So these folks shared these with me with the understanding they would be shared publicly to benefit others. And in return, they would get the benefit of a critique from me and you. So that's what we're going to do here. We're going to critique these essays. There are 4 of them. I think we'll be able to get through all 4. I will read them in their entirety. If my voice flags at any point, I might ask someone else to fill in the slack and pick up the next one just because it's a lot of talking to do this sort of thing. So here we go. The day I turned 5, I went to Vietnam and my mother took me to the Buddhist pagoda that she used to pay homage to when she was young, so I could learn about being virtuous in the same way she did. When I arrived at the main hall, I had followed my mother, stepping slowly onto the incense-perfumed carpet towards the familiar echo of a singing bowl. I stopped as my eyes reached an enlarged poster of a wheel segmented into 6, with the upper half depicting heaven and the lower showing the suffering of humans, animals, and spirits. That's the wheel of life, said my mother. Everyone inside it lives, dies, and gets reborn until they can get out of it. Why, I asked. Because the world has natural laws. If someone does many good deeds, they will have fortune, and if they commit bad deeds onto others, they will suffer throughout their life to repay that debt. When someone no longer has debt, they will be freed from the wheel, she explained. I stared at the map of the universe in awe. Although the concepts of debt and freedom were foreign to me at the time, this simple model, I thought, made sense. In my mind, this meant that any suffering was not only predestined, but profoundly necessary to attain higher levels of freedom. Later, I exited the back gates of the pagoda, directly entering the streets of Saigon to buy lunch. I optimistically skipped towards the city center, ready to use my newfound understanding as a lens to which I could guard myself from ever doing harm unto others, as well as to peek into the nature of people's past. However, as I got closer, I entered a reality that not only looked challenging, but was challenging for my recently formed worldview. The street was a scene out of any travel documentary, populated with people and their life's work. I felt as if the loud city noise tried to distract me from the difficulties that lie at the heart of Vietnamese life. Glancing down right in the middle of the street, I saw a physically disabled young man on a scooter board yelling out that he was selling lottery tickets for only a few cents while relying solely on his arms to move from inch to inch. Next to him was an elderly woman hunched over, carrying a yoke that bounced very lightly on each side to the weight of recycled glass. And not too far away, on the side of the road were children my age lying on newspaper in fetal position under the small spots of shade next to their mothers, who squat closely over open fires to cook a variety of food, from fresh sheets of rice crepes to globs of sticky rice. Instantly, I was in a dilemma. Theoretically, if I helped them, would I not just be doing a disservice by preventing them from clearing their debts? I felt my intuition resisting the logic I was newly armed with, which would justify the unjust poverty as a way that the world worked in accordance to natural law. Still, I was conflicted. I approached a mother and her child anyways. She was pouring out another sheet of crepe batter onto the heating plate, and I asked her how long she has been making crepes for. She answered 15 years, before looking warmly over to her son and waking him up to eat. He turned over, revealing limbs that appeared not only strong enough to support his own weight and eyes that were unreceptive to light and movement. The mother saw me looking and must have felt the need to explain away my gaze. He was born with neural defects. Those Americans during the war, they did this to him. Born in America, I slightly flinched at the realization that I have been wrong to assume my own innocence while thinking of others as each fully responsible for their problems. This was an innocent boy my age who has not harmed others nor done anything wrong, and even if he had, it would be foolish of me to think I could recognize and delineate all the variables, the causes and effects that constitute to his current state of being. The moment I naively oversimplified people's nuanced realities into general concepts such as debt and repayment, I not only mistakenly concluded people's problems to be fully representative of their past or debt, even when some could be to no fault of their own, but moreover, I convinced myself that the best act of service I could offer in response was to forfeit my agency and feign indifference. My perspective on people has benefited from the recognition that every choice in history belonging to an individual is full of subtlety, and my experience with getting to know the hardship that takes place in my ancestral land serves as a reminder that as I enter the field of law, I cannot make unwarranted presumptions about others, but rather be sensitive and attentive to their story. Pursuing virtue, I realized, was not necessarily about non-intervention, but precisely the opposite. In a society like Vietnam that lacks the healthcare systems, safety standards, and courts to raise about such civil support, I'm reminded that my duty is not to accept the norm and silently feel guilt, but rather to reclaim my agency and utilize it to bring about positive changes in the lives of those around me. In America, from social politics to corporate economics, there is likewise a shared suffering that has to be met with a willing resolve to change those circumstances. Having knowledge of the law will enable me to utilize my agency with attention, awareness, and empathy. Whew. All right, thoughts? Yeah, Alyssa, please.
It's a really beautiful story. Off the top of my head, I do think about one of the examples that you brought up at the beginning of the session about like, I went somewhere else and I have privilege. So that's a theme that I'm definitely thinking about. Aside from that, like if we wanted to like stick with this concept, like obviously this person has a lot of empathy and a lot of compassion, but I would be interested in seeing an actual tangible example of how they used that compassion or empathy instead of just saying like, I went to A and now I possess B inside me. I really need like an example of some time in their adult waking life of like maybe when they use the lessons from this experience to actively do something else. I'm not getting that finished part.
Thank you. I agree 100%. Yeah, I think the issue here is that this does fall within that travel essay trope I described earlier. So let's say this person presumably might be American. We obviously have to see their resume and such. But the idea here is that this 5-year-old was somewhere else. He or she went to Vietnam and had all these revelations about how life is different over there. Yes. And so the question is, okay, well, you were 5 back then. What have you done since then? You've had presumably 15, 20 years or more to actually implement some takeaway from this revelation you had as a young child. So I'm thinking also, I don't want to read stories about your childhood alone. I want to see something about how you've evolved since then from those experiences, whether positive or negative, into your daily adult life. And so, okay, you were 5 then. Let's say now you're a college student, recent graduate. Maybe you started an organization to help people like those you met or saw in Vietnam. Otherwise, okay, well, you recognize your privilege as someone in the Western world, presumably. What are you doing about it? And I'm not seeing that. And I would imagine it's there. I mean, the person, obviously, they said, intention, awareness, empathy. And I believe that. I don't think that this essay was written simply for brownie points. The question is, so let's see that next step. after that, as you said, Alyssa, precisely. So there's lots of room to cut some of the details here. I mean, the details are nice. This is very well written. And as a piece of creative writing, I can picture myself seeing the world through your eyes in that situation. But that's not the only purpose here. Let's get some creative writing, but mix it with that personal vulnerability, what's going on inside your head. And then what's your takeaway moving forward, and what have you done as a result? So there's a chance to highlight something key on the resume, specifically if it does relate to this particular trip or relates to even just helping less fortunate folks in the developing world. Other feedback, other thoughts on this one?
So in my mind, whenever someone presents a story about changing their worldview, generally one of two things in my mind has to stand out about it in order for it to be compelling. The first one is that either it was very difficult for them to change their worldview because of a bias or a preconception, or some sort of yearning to the realization, or alternatively the realization is profound. In this particular story, I didn't get the sense that they had struggled to change this worldview. In fact, they described it as a recently adopted worldview. And to me, it didn't really seem that the person had a good foundation for, any sort of belief. Rather, not a good foundation, but didn't have a solid foundation for belief, which, being 5 years old, I don't think anybody has. And everybody is going through some sort of growth at 5 years old. And the truth itself was a general truth that everybody should have, not something particularly indicating particular profound growth. So I think that the story is great. I think that the formula, so to speak, is there, but it's not impactful enough as far as how the growth occurred or what general truth was revealed, because I sincerely doubt that when they were 5, they were thinking about how it applies to law school.
Correct. Yeah, that's exactly right. I think that, as we're all agreeing here, that the formula is good and that there is something useful that can be used here. The question is, let's carry it all the way to completion. And as you said, yes, a 5-year-old isn't thinking of all this. So this author is reflecting on what they were experiencing as a 5-year-old. And obviously there was some impact, but it does need to be applied. And so I think that to continue that formula would be to say, okay, well, I went back to Vietnam 15 years later and I did some sort of charitable development work of some kind, or I was engaged in policy as a result of this in some way. And so if there's some extracurricular or work experience or even academic experience that can be tied to this, I think it can make it in a way, as you're saying, suggesting at least, more believable. Now, looking through this, I mean, I'm not seeing too much other than perspective on people, which is kind of vague. There's no action there. All right. Well, if nothing else, let's go to the second one. Would somebody like to relieve me and read out the second one? Yeah, thank you, Alyssa, please.
I was burdened with the need for legal representation during the darkest moment of my life. I was gaslit as a perpetrator of domestic violence and child abuse. This almost brought our life to its heels, as it could have cost me my daughter at an early age. As a 22-year-old Native American woman married to the man I met my first day at college. Throughout our marriage, I was a victim of relentless physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. We had a young daughter, just 5 weeks old. Despite his abuse of me, I never would have guessed that he would have hurt our daughter or that I would be suspected as the offender. That morning, I had fed Rebecca her morning bottle before I went to work. He was taking her for her checkup, then to my father's house so he could get some sleep before work. I called my husband to let him know that the direct deposit had hit our account, so he had gas money. He told me that Rebecca was having trouble breathing, had bruises over her stomach and legs, and was being examined in a separate room from him. He could not tell me what was happening or how our daughter ended up with these injuries. I trembled as my best friend and coworker drove me to the hospital, terrified for my daughter. Arriving in the Circle Drive outside the hospital, I was detained by a pair of officers and unable to see my daughter as she was fighting for her life. Unaware of the trap I had walked into, I was interrogated under duress. The white female officer intentionally misled me and used my daughter as a bargaining chip for a confession. She pitted my husband's story against mine to tell their narrative, that I was somehow responsible for my Rebecca's condition. I made repeated and futile requests for updates on my daughter until I was approached by a doctor. He told me that she had 3 brain bleeds, 6 broken ribs, a torn right labia, and 9 lacerations to her rectum. I broke. I released a wall of pain so deep that only a mother who has lost everything would understand. I collapsed on the stone and felt as if I would die right there. I watched my husband be taken away in handcuffs. I begged to see my daughter, and finally my request was granted. Would you mind scrolling up for me,
Yeah,
Steve?
sure.
Thanks. Nothing could prepare me for what I saw. My child was lifeless and attached to more tubes and cords than I thought possible. She was bruised, pale, and so fragile that I was afraid to touch her. It was in that moment that I was condemned by others. My shock was confirmation of their assumption that I enabled the abuse, or worse, had perpetrated it myself. The pediatrician began speculating, laying the groundwork for the abhorrent actions that caused her injuries, and revisiting the same questions the officers had already asked. Without the answers he wanted, I was promptly dismissed and banned from the hospital. That moment is the first time I noticed the gaslighting of my husband's abuse onto me, despite the fact that I was his victim too. This was when I knew that I truly needed help and turned to search for legal counsel. What a monumental obstacle to need support and guidance during a time that I was most vulnerable. My entire world had been ripped out from under me, and I was utterly alone and unsupported. I lacked any knowledge on how to select a lawyer, and my family support was dismal at best. My first attorney was provided by my place of employment, and he recommended a colleague once my initial interrogation was complete. I sold all of my worldly possessions just to afford his retainer. This counsel insisted and coerced me into pleading nolo contendere and assured me I would have my daughter back in 6 months or less. Had I known then what I know now, I would have fired him on the spot for ineffective counsel. My daughter and I were separated for 9 months, and I was treated as an offender, despite being a victim to domestic violence myself, which was confirmed by psychiatric evaluations, domestic violence evaluations, and many accounts by friends closest to us. Despite this, the court was insistent that I failed to protect her, despite my lack of knowledge or awareness of her abuse. In their eyes, I failed to protect her by staying with him after seeing the abuse indicators to myself. My experience echoes that of many others who need help, who do not know where to turn, or who have no idea how convoluted the legal system and its process can be. All victims need support, resources, and someone to listen, and ultimately, they need to experience love, guidance, and acceptance. I left Indian Territory with my daughter to pursue peace, safety, and healing. Since then, I have volunteered, pursued a bachelor's degree, and begun to heal. I have persevered to build a stable and quiet life. I have broken the cycle for me and my daughter, and I want to enable others to do the same. I have devoted the past 6 years to addressing the stigma tied to domestic violence, changing how it is discussed, helping victims make informed decisions through resources and support, and drawing attention to how victims are often gaslighted as the aggressors. Getting my law degree will help me to make an even larger impact, to create a path to educated decisions, to provide adequate resources, and to ensure due process for all voices to be heard. I embrace the opportunity to change myself and improve situations by meeting challenges head on. Living through hell has taught me that legal representation need not be a burden at life's darkest moment, but a torch lighting the way out.
Wow. Yeah, powerful statement. Thank you for reading that. A lot going on there. So this statement, this person's clearly a strong person who's been through a lot, most that at least a lot of folks can't even imagine, I'm sure. And so the question is how to tell this in a way that seems appropriate to the task at hand. I think that there's so much going on here that I would wonder if this person might want to divide it into multiple statements, just because it's a lot taken it at one time. but it's powerful, and I think this is a great material here. And just my kudos to this person for being open and honest enough to share their story with others as well. Anyone have thoughts on this they want to share?
Well, I have an actual particular question on this one, not necessarily related to content, but I'm presuming from the essay that she pleaded no contest for a particular charge. So I'm wondering if this should be an addendum for character and fitness as opposed to a personal statement.
That's a good question. Yeah. So here, nolo contendere. So yeah, so no contest. And so this counsel insisted in coerced me into pleading. So that would be a character and fitness, most likely. And so at least part of this could be discussed there. The things around ineffective counsel and everything related to evaluate all these evaluations, encounters with the legal system like that. Yeah, that would be character and fitness, that portion specifically. So at least some of this could be discussed there. That's
okay.
Right.
And just for general knowledge, and then I'll yield because I want this person to get feedback. Is it okay to have an addendum talking about one thing and then your personal statement talking about the same thing? Because I know for like diversity statements, for example, it's generally preferable to have a separate topic for a personal statement than that kind of addendum.
That's a good question. Yeah, I think under other circumstances, I would say, yeah, it's better to have it so as not to make only one thing the focus here. But in this particular case, I don't know that I could necessarily say that. I feel like this is so impactful on this person's life that I wouldn't necessarily tell them that they need to talk about something else in a different statement. I think it's a character and fitness statement wouldn't do justice to everything this person has been through and experienced.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. But I think there's so much substance here, so much to describe, so much of story to tell that I think it could easily fill at least two statements, both a character and fitness and a personal statement. And this person mentions she's a Native American woman, so maybe there's a diversity statement there too if she wants.
Steve?
Yes?
I have a question. If you compare this statement with the before, do you see that this person needs to improve something, or do you have any feedback to say about that related to the before say?
So you mean contrasting them in terms of which one I think could be improved in some way?
Yes, I would like if you can do this.
Well, I mean, to me, they're quite different, and that's based in part on the author's particular writing styles. And then there's just the gravity of each one. I mean, I think we can all agree that this second one is far deeper and more impactful. We can really see how this person's life has been impacted by what she's been through. The previous one was a 5-year-old going on a trip with her mother. And then we're not really sure how it impacts her life in the more modern sense. So I think the second one is far more impactful and definitely leaves a real impression, at least on me. And so I think that any statement doesn't have to go to this depth necessarily, but to show how you've been impacted by something and how it's affected you on the level of your soul in a way, I think that's always going to have a bigger impact than a travel essay, at least.
Thank you, Steve.
Yeah, of course. Other thoughts on this one? How could this person improve how she tells her story?
Go ahead.
Cassandra.
No, it's okay. Go ahead.
I actually have questions because I'm still learning myself. I see just a few different plumb lines through here. I see the first paragraph really, and it's sprinkled with talking about her relationship to her abuser. So to me, that's a very hearty line that maybe she could stick with. And then there's this obviously very important, like second plumb line of her relationship with her daughter and seeing her daughter's injuries and that sort of traumatic event and taking her daughter out of the abuser's hands. And then there's this other plumb line of what you've already mentioned of like being a Native American woman. And also at the end, in the last paragraphs, speaking about all the actual action that she had taken and ways that she had overcome and transitioned all of this pain into maybe some actionable items. But to me, the relationship to the abuser is a little bit different than the relationship to the daughter. And I would ask if maybe take one of those and really develop that, and instead of trying to tell both of those stories.
Agreed. No, thanks for calling that out in that particular way. I agree that there's a lot going on here, and that's why I was thinking multiple statements, but you really gave some specifics about what exactly could be separated. So I would certainly agree with that. And it's hard to imagine this person even just covering all of this in 2 essays. And so I wonder if there's a way to do 3. And so maybe if she writes a diversity statement that with the angle, at least to start off, about being Native American, that might relate in some way to pulling one of those other plumb lines as well in that same statement. And then I also want to call out just this author, how she does end it talking about, she says, I've broken the cycle for me and my daughter. I've devoted the past 6 years to addressing the stigma tied to domestic violence. So to me, that's ending on a positive, uplifting, inspiring note, which I really like, that it's not just all the problems she's been through alone. Because that you don't want it to simply end on a depressing note, especially the main statement of your application. And life may not always work out that way where you can end on a high note, but if there's something that you can do, as she has here, despite everything she and her daughter have been through.
Steve, I was going to ask a stylistic question.
Sure.
Obviously, this passage, as compared to the first one, it held my attention a lot more than the first one did. Even though when I see it, it looks like stylistically it's a little bit more simplistic. Do you think because the story is so compelling that you would or would not recommend, maybe making it stylistically more complex, or do you think as it's written now and the style is effective because of the weight of the story?
I get what you're saying, yeah, and I think that the weight of the story does warrant it being a more simplistic, sentence structure, vocabulary usage, if that's the person's writing style. I wouldn't want them to lose their voice dressing up very harsh realities. And so if that's how this person wants to go about it, I mean, as I've discussed in the past, like the person reading your application they're a human being, they're personal, they're impacted by things like that. And so, for me, I would find this extremely compelling, even as is. I think we can improve it significantly, as we've discussed. But if the topic and the story is compelling, that could definitely earn it some quote unquote points alone. That being said, having someone to edit, to proofread, to copy edit, all of that's always a good idea. And copy editing alone isn't even necessarily that expensive. If one can make the investment, it's possible to find copy editors for a pretty reasonable rate. And that's why I'm not doing this here. I'm going deeper to like the actual topics and structures of the stories overall. But yeah, I would say I'm not saying I noticed any errors here in particular, but there might be someone who could help improve some of the wording. And that's why reading this out loud is so valuable, because it helps you see things that might be awkward, things that are just an error, or things that could be improved. Other comments on this one?
So I just have a quick comment. Full disclosure, I have an undergrad in English. So one thing that I was thinking at the end of it is that so people that are reading on the admission committees are people, and sometimes people read with their emotions, and I would hate for her strong story to make the end, which is really important, be lost. So maybe finding a way to like hint at the beginning why this matters for her law degree, like how she will be a better practitioner and lawyer as a result of this.
Agreed. Yeah, I think the end, although it ends on an uplifting note, the specifics are missing here. And maybe her resume covers that, but at least I would want her to give at least like one clause or one line devoted to that specific, even if it's in the resume as well, just to remind us, okay, she has a clear path and she's done some work addressing stigma on domestic violence. What exactly has she done, or what exactly will she want to do with a law degree? Just rather than just simply making a larger impact. So I agree, there are some specifics that could be laid out a bit more there, even just with the same number of words, just swapping. All right, let's go on to the third. Okay, so how is a ticket the size of a poppy seed able to cause so much suffering? Here I was at 18 years old, walking out of my car with a handicapped parking pass. I received plenty of glares and confused faces because nothing looked physically wrong with me, but my body was aching, it hurt to use the stairs, and I was feeling unimaginable pain. I went doctor to doctor with no one able to help me. I felt lost, like no one would believe the symptoms I was experiencing. From podiatrists to physical therapists to rheumatologists to general practitioner, no one could figure it out. I started to feel apathetic towards things I used to enjoy doing. I felt alone and began to spiral into depression. School became difficult for me, and so did little things such as getting out of bed. Finally, after getting extensive blood work done, my doctor had good news for me. Now, this is not what most people would consider good news. Finding out you've been suffering from Lyme disease, Rocky Mountain spotted fever, and mycoplasma pneumonia. For me, however, it provided a better outlook for the future. I felt a sense of relief to finally receive a diagnosis from my doctors. I felt validated after being an advocate for myself for so long. I knew the treatment was just beginning, but the diagnosis meant the search for answers was over. During this journey, I learned how to mature and become an adult. I had just graduated high school and turned 18, which meant my parents couldn't always hold my hand during every doctor's appointment anymore. Turning 18 means freedom and independence, but transitioning to adulthood is not always easy. I had to learn to advocate for myself, to never give up, and to trust my gut. The agony of spending so much time at the doctor's just to be referred to somewhere else felt like it would never end. There were plenty of days I let the disease get the best of me. Through this, I had to learn to get back up and fight. This diagnosis is an experience for which I will always be grateful because I learned many valuable lessons that have made me a better person. I got a medical withdrawal from all my classes for the semester, but couldn't let falling behind my peers frustrate me. Reflecting on the experience, I was able to learn how to be an advocate for myself and better communicate. Being a shy kid growing up, I avoided meeting new people and stepping out of my comfort zone. I was reliant on my parents to hold my hands through life. But this experience showed me to speak up for myself. I received a higher level of confidence in myself, knowing that I was a fighter. I learned to be resilient and went back to school the next semester determined to succeed. I am proud of myself for learning how to deal with the challenges that have come my way and becoming an overall stronger person. While my symptoms may fade, the lessons I have learned will stick with me. After coming back to college after my medical withdrawal, I decided to try out for my college's cheerleading team. Cheerleading is the sport I have loved since I was 7 and unfortunately had to take a break from during treatment. Through my determination, I was able to make the team and push through relearning some skills. Being able to participate again in the sport I love at the collegiate level has helped me to recognize the emotional and physical strength I have gained. I hope to continue challenging myself during law school. I have the strength and knowledge to get back up and succeed after hitting rock bottom. I am now motivated to be an advocate for my others. I found my voice through my diagnosis, but not everyone has the resources that are needed to speak up for themselves. Through my college coursework, I have been able to explore many aspects of the legal system. Now I want to study criminal law and be a public defender. I want to help give a voice to those that our system is leaving out. Okay, thoughts? Emily's saying what? Emily's not a fan.
It's because they're talking about medical stuff, and I was like, okay, maybe they weren't told to leave the addenda in the addenda section. And then they get like back to coming from cheerleading, and I was like, okay, so this is like an athletics kind of essay. And then I got lost again because they're talking about criminal law and a public defender, and like getting that from being unparentified, we're changing directions like 3 different times.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, not to be too harsh on this person, but this is kind of like random stuff about me, like starting off with the Lyme disease and other things, and then just kind of, okay, well, here's some other stuff you should know, like the lessons I've learned, and then I'll do cheerleading and I'll do criminal law, and I don't see too much how they tie together. Yeah, so agree there. I don't mind being a little bit more critical on this one, just because I think sugarcoating it isn't going to serve anyone here. People need to know what's wrong with this one in order to help everybody improve. So it's in that spirit. This is meant to be constructive criticism, But I think that the point about doing multiple statements around these, I think is well taken.
Yeah, I think if you just cut like the top part of the essay, I would be like, oh, they're gonna do like defense work for people, or rather plaintiffs work for like medical malpractice cases and talking up for the patient. And then we get down to public defender. I'm like, where did this come from? They need to talk about criminal law or what they did in college that has to do with criminal law. Did they intern for a judge? Did they where did it come?
I think if we stop here, like at the end of this paragraph is like takeaways. This diagnosis is an experience. I learned X, Y, Z. I reflected, okay, well, if you hammer out exactly the lessons that you learned, I mean, so you said that you were shy and you were maybe advocating for yourself. I think that was mentioned. Okay, so give me some examples of that. And then all the other stuff, that's separate. That's like, okay, well, I had to take a break from college for a semester maybe. And that kind of took me out of the running in terms of like my transcript has a gap. Explain that somewhere else. Brief addendum, matter of fact, to the point. But go much deeper on the medical stuff. Medical stuff is also tricky. You don't want to be, again, solely negative, but if you really highlight some experiences, that'll at least, I think, put this in a much better place.
I agree with Elisa. Like the telling is too much. The showing needs to be like more examples or like situations.
Yeah. Let's hear more on that.
One question. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yeah, first, Alyssa, do you want to share more on the show, don't tell?
Oh, yeah, for sure. So, I mean, this is something that you say all this time, Steve, like show us, don't tell us. And I find a lot of the telling is, can you scroll down actually a little bit for me?
Sure.
Okay. That should be great because it's all right. So even something like a sentence like, while my symptoms may fade, the lessons I have learned will stick with me. A sentence like that, I feel in a personal statement is not necessary, because if you do show us what you're doing, like the people reading these are very smart enough to say, oh, this lesson is directly how they have applied themselves from what they just said previously. So there's a lot of sentences like that in this particular statement. Earlier too, about having to be independent when they go to the doctor's offices. If they did want to talk about that, you could just talk about the exact interaction you had at the doctor's office. How did you speak to the doctor? How did you overcome the obstacle of maybe you were unsure of yourself when you had to deal with scheduling or the receptionist or not understanding certain terms? Like if you actually say, I think a good question too to ask myself of like when I start to tell more than show is just what happened, what really happened, and what did I do about it, instead of a lot of the like a backseat sort of driving of saying, and then I had determination, then I had independence. Exactly.
Those vague introductory like preface types of statements, they've all got to go. So like, this is an experience for which I will always be grateful because I learned many valuable lessons. Okay, well, let's just get to the valuable lessons. I learned X, Y, Z, or even better, just show us that you learned these things. Like, I don't know all the details of the Lyme disease and the other stuff, but I'm thinking of, let's say somebody suddenly became diabetic and had to inject themselves with insulin and they were scared of needles. Like that would be a process by which you develop some independence and overcome a fear that you have. And you're doing it every single day. So it's a very real thing on the ground that shows us in a way that just saying valuable lessons doesn't do. And we have to kind of guess at what those lessons are. And then like, okay, well, you had the medical withdrawal, you came back, you did cheerleading. Well, how does cheerleading relate to Lyme disease? I don't see that connection. I'm like, you're stronger, but how? So the doctor gave you bad advice and you did your own research and discovered something new, or you had a conflict with your parents around this. And you had the backing, you did the research, you made a case for yourself, whatever it was, or even just, should you take off a semester or not? Maybe that was a debate where, again, you stood up for yourself. You advocated for what you thought were your best needs at the time. I know there was someone else who had a comment or a question they wanted to share. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you great. Thank you.
Okay, I just want to ask, if she started the essay talking about the medical condition and then how she bounced back and became a college athlete, would it been okay, or it's already too much, like two different directions?
I think it's okay. I think that in a way that the cheerleading could serve the goal of ending on a positive note, especially if there are lessons learned from the medical withdrawal during that time away that then informed, again, like the bravery to try out for something, taking the risk involved, if that was something that was true for this author.
And how could she bounce back and this from how you relate to law school? Because I think that's what she tried to do, but she didn't do a great job with. How could she do better to transition this to how you apply to law school?
That's an excellent question. So one idea that comes to mind for me here, just as a starting point, is at the end, I'm now motivated to be an advocate for others. Okay, so why? Again, tie it back to the medical experience. Where did she need to advocate for herself there? Or where, had she not had the wherewithal to stand up for herself, maybe another patient in a similar position would have suffered as a result of failing to have that confidence. And so people like that who may not have the knowledge or may not have the experience or just the strength of character or the drive to do that or the extroversion, whatever it is, maybe they need an advocate like this future lawyer to help them in that process, to help them navigate bureaucracies, to navigate red tape, whatever it was. Especially in medicine, there's lots of time, of course, in medicine, there's lots of cases of like, there's the status quo and there's some new revolutionary thing, or there's maybe multiple ways one could go about treating an issue. And there's the default, and then there's whatever you discover and you push for. So I could see that potentially playing out here or in other medical focused essays. And I wouldn't always want people to write a medical focused essay. If they have another topic might be better. These topics can get a little bit into the weeds sometimes, or end up being too negative sometimes as well, and fall into the trap of making excuses. I don't think this one is doing that. I think this author is making a real effort to draw out the lessons and on a positive note. So that's a great thing, but I could see others maybe going down that road.
Okay, thank you.
I'm going to call a couple of other comments here. James wrote, towards the middle, the maturity and independence part was repetitive. Yeah, so I think that's around here specifically. And so maybe just summarize that, like cut it shorter. I agree there. And then Michaela is saying, would you implement 2 life examples into your personal statement? Do you put the 2 into the personal statement? Yeah, maybe, especially if you can tie them together. I think that's the key, is not make it like 2 separate things that you just want to talk about, both of them. Personal statement has X word count, but it's not any 600 words or 500 words you want. Make it flow smoothly. And so some essays should be cut into multiple: diversity statement, character and fitness, optional addenda. All those are fine other places to include it. Also knowing that you'll have your resume to at least reference something you want them to know about. Any other questions or comments on this one?
The one thing I'd add at the end, particularly after she finishes talking about the cheerleading and tries to change over criminal law, is she does seem to want to be talking about like helping indigent clients, which I think is a good thing to talk about. But I don't see the equivalence of helping indigent people just because you yourself have learned to be an independent adult. And I wished that had been, clarified or elaborated upon when she's talking about that in the last paragraph.
Yes, well, naturally, indigent and independent are 2 very different things. So I could see why that's not really coming across here. To the idea, like I guess we were talking about the idea of being a public defender. So to me, I mean, I didn't even like give that too much attention just because it's so disconnected. So if she can make a strong case for herself about why she's looking to advocate for others based on her own experience, maybe having to advocate for herself, then fantastic. Make that case. But to me here, it's like, to me, that's like an aside that doesn't really even fit at all. So if you don't want to tie it to law school, you don't have to, but it's nice if you can. And I think there is a way to do that here. But yes, I agree that it's not connected at the moment. Thanks for calling that out.
Steve,
yes?
Just to understand, so in your point of view, it's not so good a person say in a statement that he would like or should like to be a public defender, specific in a way, would the person become to be after finished the law school? Isn't it?
You can mention it, or you can mention it. You don't have to, certainly. They know that your goals may change over time and you may not know all the intricacies of all the different areas of law. And obviously, criminal law is one that is more in the public eye. People are more aware of it in part because of media and such, and because it's obviously an exciting topic. So I suppose that if one can make a compelling case in some way, even simply saying, I want to advocate for those who can't advocate for themselves, that alone could be enough. You don't need to have tons of work experience in that particular area. But if you have something, mention it, and certainly don't feel the obligation to mention it. And if it doesn't tie in smoothly, I might not.
Okay, thank you again.
Of course. It's a great question. All right, so the fourth and last personal statement, would somebody help me out and read this one?
Sure.
Thank you.
It was Thursday, March 12th, 2020, and I was walking down the streets of New York to pick up the kids from my movement class. I casually opened up Facebook one last time before anyone showed up, and there was the headline: Governor Cuomo announces Broadway will close today at 5 p.m. until further notice. I felt my head spin, and I was forced to sit wherever I was. What does that mean about my job at Moulin Rouge tomorrow? I just signed 2 large production management contracts. What would happen to those? I built my life around producing and creating theater in New York, and in one fell swoop, it was all gone. I was forced to contemplate the extent of all this. This was something much bigger than anything I had experienced. I was 13, and I woke up to get ready for school. My mom was on the phone to my sister. This was odd. My sister lived 3 hours ahead of us in Vancouver and at university, no less. Why was she calling mom so early? I sat on the steps looking up at her as she rushed to the TV to turn it on. Then I saw it. In a world so far away from Mars, 2 buildings standing in ruins. The moments that followed are unclear. I did not understand the full devastation of New York City, but understood the fear as we went to school that day. Classes were about watching the news, the effects on us in Hawaii with the threats to our telescopes, military bases, and Pearl Harbor, talking about what we should be thankful for, or letting us sit and reflect on what happened and how this would change everything. Broadway closed for 2 days that week. I knew what they said before I opened them. The furlough email from the Moulin Rouge merchandise team, the cancellation of the off-Broadway show I would manage, the indefinite postponement of the opera festival I already created preliminary schedules for. I just completed a site visit yesterday to scope out the theater and confirm our rental contract. I just wrote emails to designers scheduling meetings to discuss budgets and deadlines. It was an avalanche of change. Wear a mask, 6 feet apart, no gatherings, with lines outside every grocery store, even though there was no toilet paper, hand sanitizer, or soap. I followed Governor Cuomo's briefing every day and watched the rising number of infected, 500, 700, 900. But then the death toll. I remember when we broke 1,000. I also remember when we averaged 500 deaths a day in the city alone. My roommate Leslie was a hospital worker. She was needed, wanted, and useful, but this came at a price. After she would strip out of her scrubs at the door to shower, I would wipe down every surface she came in contact with. We would sit down and talk about the death toll breaking records, the refrigerated trucks outside of hospitals, the prisoners digging mass graves because people couldn't afford multiple funeral services. We went through so many different stages of grief, fear, gratefulness, and terror. Life had changed, and it was not temporary. For someone who had planned all her life, had followed solid and logical paths, who made lists and assessed consequences, I was suddenly stuck, simply forced to exist. What does a planner do when she cannot plan? How do I answer the questions? What am I doing this week? Where do I see myself in 5 years? What goals do I want to achieve and places I want to live? This was not something one could plan for. I had to search deeper for a sense of purpose in the murky waters. I found myself wanting to be of use, to be active in this fight for survival in whatever way I could. My career in theater management and production might be gone, but all my skills were still there. Painting and creating, organizing and planning, designing and building, managing and scheduling, sewing. I bought a sewing machine and started sewing hundreds of masks and donated them to whomever I could. Philadelphia, Columbia Hospital, Leslie's Hospital, my neighbors, mailing them to Hawaii and Canada. I also got in contact with a healthcare worker who had to find childcare for her now homeschooled 4-year-old. In between masks, I would make dinosaurs out of toilet paper rolls and teach Hannah how to count Cheerios. This came at a cost, of course. Hannah's mom and Leslie were in constant contact with sick patients, and there would be those 6 to 12 hours we would wait on edge until the testing eventually came back negative. I exhaled from that possible reality and realized that I had a purpose, a way that I can help people that transcends pandemics, economic hardships, restructuring of society, and forced isolation. People were losing their jobs and their homes, struggling to eat. What were our rights? What rules protected us, and how do we change those that don't? And then the protest started, and I felt something inside cry out. Although it wasn't my voice, it was, I was an ally that could fight for injustice. As I marched the streets, I decided what I needed to do. I will use my strength, resilience, leadership, and privilege to make a difference in this new society. This is a year of enlightenment and change. Through losing it all, those walls you build up in life culturally and socially, I found what drives me at the core of my being. I want to be able to help people, to be of service to the people who can't fight for themselves. Every human is important and makes a difference. My fight and passion for life is not new, but redirected into something better. I'm invigorated to pursue this educational path and carve a new destiny that is even brighter than before. I am not going to be an audiobook author, that's for sure.
No, thank you, Emily. I appreciate it very much. So we've got COVID. We've got COVID as a major theme here.
So it's really hard to think of any particular constructive criticism because the essay was just all over the place. One of the biggest things that stood out to me was the second paragraph there. Stephen, and it reminds me of something Stephen King said, which was kill your darlings. You could literally take out that entire paragraph and the overall story and understanding of it would not be inhibited. And by Stephen King's advice, it should be done in that case. Another thing was that I liked how the story started off with how they were specifically and directly impacted by COVID, and I felt like there was a lot of potential for that, but it just went to so many other different things that it became generic towards the end. And I think with that particular introduction can be expanded on, and there can be a story to it, but I think that this is a good example, especially towards the end, to be cautious, especially if you're writing about COVID, because that's something that a lot of people are going to write about. So if you are going to write about it, it really needs to be personal and unique, something that not many others can have a claim to how they were impacted by COVID.
Exactly. Thank you for that. I couldn't agree more. The idea that it should be something that only you could write. And most of us could write something about watching the numbers rise of the infected with the governor's briefings, right? Especially those of us in New York anyway. Others have similar. So the question is, what's so different about wiping things down, for example? And these stories, the details here could be anywhere in the country and maybe even anywhere in the world, at least those countries that have not handled COVID quite so well. Also agreed with cutting out that second paragraph. You could cut it out and lose nothing at all. The flow would even continue smoothly. So it's really just an aside. I know some other folks had comments.
Yeah, where's his or her, like, why law? Like, if you submitted this same essay to any other graduate program, like pick medical school, pick dental school, like whatever, like none of this is just like, I want a job that I want to work for people in like some other capacity that's more secure during like crazy insane times like 9/11 and COVID. Like there's nothing about this that says why law at all.
Correct. Yeah, there's not. And it could go there maybe. I mean, as James was saying, like with the opening, like you feel like it's going somewhere. Like, okay, Moulin Rouge, they got in third paragraph, let's jump to that, they got furloughed. So we have a very like work-focused opening here. So the career being impacted, obviously, but what happens then? Was there something that maybe this author did at his or her job? And you're scoping out the theater, confirming rental contract. Okay, I'm like, contract, that's legal. Maybe we can do something there, but then it veers away and zooms out to statements virtually anybody could relate to, which is if it's too relatable, then it's not personal enough.
Oh, I read that as she or he did all of those things the day before the COVID stuff. And so she or he was remembering when it was normal and she or he had done all that work. And then afterwards, like all the contracts were cut off because of the Broadway shutdowns.
Agreed. Yeah, no, so it's indicating the disruption, but then there's still fallout from that. If they just signed a contract, maybe now they want to get out of it. So I don't think this person meant to go there, but I'm saying that would be like, instead of going left, go right. And this person could take those paragraphs, maintain them largely the same, at least compared to the other stuff, at least, and then go somewhere totally different, but cut a lot of the things afterwards. Someone's writing in the comments here about how undergrad, they put a separate COVID impact essay, wondering if law schools will do the same. I mean, yeah, we haven't seen this year's applications, and so I suppose anything's possible. We'll find out in a month or two. But yeah, regardless, it would be somewhere separate if you want to do a COVID specific thing. I don't love the idea of making it a focus of a main personal statement, just because, again, they're going to get so many of those. Other comments and thoughts on this one?
I think the author kind of jumped into how they decided they wanted to go to law school. It was, well, I went to the rally and I had this change and I knew that I wanted to go. I think with the current situation, people have a lot more time. So maybe to talk about the thought process. Now I had this feeling and then I sat down, I thought about it, I did the research, I looked into it, and here's why. Here's what I felt after I had this feeling. That feeling led me down this road, and this is why I'm writing to you about it.
So you're referring to that last paragraph, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm glad you brought that up, actually, because it was kind of like an ending point, next steps kind of thing. The author concludes, I'm invigorated to pursue this path and carve a new destiny. It seems tied into the passion around, I presume, what this author is referring to as Black Lives Matter, marching the streets and such. So if it is in fact that, then it could be a separate statement, potentially. I just don't see it being that much tied to if the author does continue with the Moulin Rouge work and what happened there. But talking about protests and current events and marching and related to that, okay, well, again, this, as you said, this is like a temporary thing in the short term. What's continuing going forward is my question, in terms of, is this impacting career goals? If so, that's totally fine. Just iron it out with specifics.
Yeah, like you could be doing social work, you could be doing a criminal justice master's degree, you could be doing a psychology, like you could be doing a police science, like that doesn't specifically say law. I thought about the current events and therefore X. X doesn't have to be law in BLM. It could be race relations, it could be communications, it could be political science. It was just it got more abstract as I kept reading, and I was like, oh no.
Right, yeah. And if this author does have some legal work experience of some kind, that will strengthen the case for law school, but I might mention it to make some of these vague statements more concrete and then remove the vague statements. So basically just swap it around again is what I'm saying, but to tie it into the excitement of the short term, what's been going on the past few months, it may not continue for everybody into the fall and beyond. So the question is, if this is something that this author is passionate about, let's make that case in a more convincing way.
And also, and I don't know if this is like a personal pet peeve of mine, but like, do you want to be the kind of person who is expressing that they're a reactionary in your essay, which is kind of how that comes off, like, oh, I only thought about this as protests got bad at that point. Because what happens when you're in like your 10th day of reading documents that you know, if they go into Big Law, for example, that you want to like make sure which ones are privileged or not, and you don't have that exciting feeling, like, are you going to drop out of being a lawyer because that's your reactionary type personality? And I would sort of worry about their long-term happiness in a profession that if this is how they're already starting off.
I like that a lot. Yeah.
Something to be needed.
Yeah. I made a similar point in my workshop this past Thursday. Inside the course, I was talking about how a lot of people have recently become very aware about police brutality, Black Lives Matter, and all that. And so if you don't have the work experience to back it up prior to that point, prior to this spring, let's say, or summer, then it's not going to mean as much to them. There's going to be tons of essays about people who were super inspired in the past few months, and they're applying this fall, but their only experience is going to these protests or doing things online just in the past few months alone. So are you going to stick with it if you have work experience to back it up, that'll mean a lot more. Yeah, because most of the actual legal work is not as exciting as marching on the streets.
And if I could answer the question about reactionary, I think it's okay in this particular instance if she didn't say that, well, this ended my career as a planner, which honestly I find that a little bit hard to believe because this is temporary. It will certainly have an adverse impact on your ability to do any jobs, but you will eventually be able to re-enter that field. So if she were to say something like, I realize that as much as I love this job, it's unstable at the present time, and I had to make a hard choice about, a career decision, and law school is the best decision because X, Y, Z. And, and to do that in a way that isn't so telling, but kind of shows, but I kind of think it's a bit difficult to do. So I'd say you can do it. Law school can be a second choice, and that's okay, even if it's a reactionary choice, but it has to be done in a compelling and careful way, I think.
Yeah, and you do want to tie some things from the past to the future goals. But Emily, go ahead.
I was gonna say, if she or he was interested, like looking at organizations like Volunteer Lawyers for the Arts, and then you could say, okay, here I have my art background. The law is going to add something to that, but I'll still have the prior experience to make both of those things, when added together, a good fit or a good match. And even if you do end up in, for example, like I said, a big law job, you'll have that you can do on the side to help out the community that you used to be with in the theater industry or in the arts industry. So there's a way to connect them together, but this isn't it.
Right. Yeah. Thanks for that. One other comment, two other things that come to mind. One is the sewing machine thing. That's another thing that I think could be chopped out entirely, and the flow would still go pretty smoothly here. The other thing is I got a kick out of the dinosaurs out of toilet paper rolls and counting Cheerios, but it seems kind of silly compared to the gravity of what comes in the following paragraph. And so I don't love it that I think one tone or the other, or at least have a smoother flow from one to the other. Not you're making me laugh, then you're making me feel passion for justice, right? Like those two things don't really seem to be of the same level of gravity. And so at least some separation or some transition, or since I don't see the sewing masks thing tied to the rest of this essay, I would just chop it out altogether. And maybe that's a line on the resume, or maybe it's a separate statement, although I'm not sure. I mean, hundreds of masks, that's impressive. That's great. I mean, that could be a separate essay, maybe, but it could also just be a couple of lines on the resume. Let's see, any other final comments or questions or reflections around this essay? All right, well, if not, then we will wrap up here for the evening, but thanks to all of you for joining and asking such great questions, giving some great comments and great feedback for these folks. I'm sure they will greatly appreciate it, and I hope that you all got a lot of value out of it as well to apply to your own statements. And so we're doing these sessions regularly in the course. We're covering everybody's drafts. We're also going to go on to diversity statements, character and fitness, optional essays and addenda, resume, all that good stuff inside the course over the next couple of months. I may do the occasional public event as well, but if you want yours reviewed, the course is the best way to do that. And so details on the site. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions or need anything, and I will hopefully see you all soon. Have a good night, and thanks for joining. Bye all. Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.